Good afternoon. Good afternoon. Let's try again. Good afternoon.
Good afternoon.
Okay. Good afternoon. This is something we do in Detroit that we say to one another, is greet each other. So thank you for letting me be in your space and in the conference today. And yesterday too, I was blown away by so many people putting really their hearts and minds and their soul into some of the work that is really, I think, painful in a lot of ways, and I also think very distressing, to say the least, and has high stakes for a lot of people. Particularly, from my worldview, I live in Southwest Detroit, and I am a fourth generation Detroiter, settler on Anishinaabe land, and have been trying to do work in Detroit over the last 10 years to talk about toxicity in the world that I live in and the world that I've inherited from my grandparents. Paternally, my father came from Colombia in 1970, so I identify as cis, I identify as hetero, I was raised Christian, so I put all of that on the table to sort of say, you know, these are the things that I bring into my community. I was educated here from hardworking parents, and have the ability to be up here speaking with you all. And these are my privileges that I sort of set out. I think what I want to talk about today is both a little bit about Detroit and how I see it today and what's been going on just over the last really few weeks with me from my vantage point, because there's so much that's going on in Detroit right now, and there are so many people talking about Detroit, whether or not they've ever set foot in Detroit or not. And there's so many imaginaries about what Detroit can be or should be without ever having visited that place. And I think that that's dangerous. I think it's unethical. And I think that it's deeply problematic, particularly for the people who live there. Because it again is a process of what we're talking about, right, in environmental justice, that we should value the people who are most impacted first, and then we should raise up the voices of those people who experience those livelihoods so that we can center knowledges of experience also and primarily. And I think that's super important, because ultimately when the shit hits the fan on climate change and as it begins to unfold before our eyes, we're all going to be responsible for our own survival. And so what that means in your particular location, whenever the flood comes, right, as we've been seeing, when the drought comes, nobody's gonna know what to do but you, right? And that's self-determination. As I said, I'm fourth generation, fifth generation. My children living in a 4-block radius of Southwest Detroit, 4 blocks away from the busiest northern border in international trade. At the peak, we saw 16,000 semi-trucks come through our neighborhood every day, which brought with it diesel emissions. Actually, there's a scholar here, Amy Schultz, who will talk about the impacts of diesel emissions on communities. The 2 or 3 days after 9/11, if you follow the hospital admissions, you will see a spike in hospitalizations from stroke and cardiac arrest, because the trucks were sitting at the border on 9/11 for so long that it created a toxic plume that fell, and it clogged up the hearts and the brains of my neighbors and friends and loved ones. So those types of things are imminent, they're happening. The other thing that came with 9/11 was an enormous amount of border patrol. So the Latino diaspora landed in Southwest Detroit because Ford went to the border and recruited workers from the US-Mexico border during the Mexican Revolution to recruit them to come to Detroit. And they literally dropped them off in Southwest Detroit, Mexican town. Said, okay, mostly men, right? Here's your row house, you know, go look for a job. And of course that was very racialized, right? So how you looked, the way that you talked, if you could pass, if you could speak English, meant a better job, right? And so a lot of people came up looking for work, including my great-grandparents, and they actually didn't land work in the motor company until the 70s because they weren't white enough or they didn't speak English, right? So in the aftermath of NAFTA, we saw another generation come up, right, from Mexico and Latin America, and that was a new wave of folks, and we really feel like in the community that at least we created a cultural web and a cultural network, stores, music, rental properties that helped welcome that new wave of immigrants, right? But when 9/11 happened, you know, a lot of the things that my parents and grandparents did to help build resiliency for our community were rendered null and void because Border Patrol is so aggressive. You know, at certain points we're fighting them from sitting outside of schools, right? Sitting outside of churches, going to our grocery stores for lunch break and, hey, giving me that, hi, how you doing, smile, and I'm like, because just their presence in our neighborhoods is a threat to safety, right? There's so many stories about that. Now, interesting about Mexican town in Southwest Detroit is that as we see some of the folks coming in, they're not staying where we sort of settled initially, right? They're going to suburbs, Lincoln Park, Melvindale, that are inner ring suburbs of Detroit that are underfunded. Lincoln Park is going through bankruptcy, so in a kind of way it invisibilizes people in a way that perhaps living in Southwest Detroit, Mexican town didn't, because it was super visible with its proximity to downtown. But because downtown is growing, and if you've been to downtown or you read the newspaper, downtown is so shiny and awesome and there's great places to eat, and Mexican town is now like the wing to that. So with that comes a lot of gentrification, and so by ICE sort of evacuating some of these families are creating spaces for gentrification to take place really rapidly. Now, all of that to say that Mexican town, right, the contested name that we all sort of talk about, is just one part of Southwest Detroit. The other parts of Southwest Detroit are also contested spaces, and as you go further south are more heavily industrialized. So the River Rouge plant was the home and the birthplace of the UAW, and is enormous. It's an enormous complex that once encompassed not only the River Rouge complex, but also had its own steel company, right, that was actually attached to it. And around it, supporting facilities, right, like Carmeuse Lime, US Steel, 28 different toxic facilities. Now, 48217 is the home of those smokestacks and is a primarily African-American neighborhood. Now, most people who have been raised up around Detroit know that it's the most segregated metropolitan. Well, we kind of compete with Chicago, right, for the worst thing ever in the world. And that, you know, the stories of the families that you talk to is, okay, well, we'd be cruising in the 60s, right, and we get to Livernois and we turn around, right, because, like, you stay in your hood. But in 48217, it's like, oh, we were cruised, but then we would turn around at Schaefer, right? So you have Mexican, Latino, identified Puerto Ricans, Colombians, whatever, cruising and then turning around, and then you have black families turning and then turning this way, right? So there's this space that social institutions and political institutions, they weren't